Well, thank you very much, Peter. Of course, it is a great honor for all of us to have Marshall Goldman be a guest here at the Southern Center for International Studies, a guest in Atlanta, and representing several wonderful institutions with which many of us have had relationships in the past over a wide range of subjects and interests and courses and whole degrees. And that is, Marshall, as you know, is an economist and is a professor at Wellesley College, but he's also a senior scholar and for many years the associate director of the Davis Center at Harvard University. That's a center that is really preeminent in studying over decades the developments in what was the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation. So with that, Marshall, I'm very, very glad for you to be here. I would set this up. We are here to talk about Petrostate, the book, Petrostate, the idea, Petrostate, the practical and political entity that is moving forward. It's moving forward, of course, miraculously from its past, its especially most recent past. If any of us, I think, or except for maybe Mr. Putin himself, had thought what would happen after 1998 when the country was essentially bankrupt and under great challenge, people would have very much doubted that we would have this conversation here tonight, or the few that did see it coming or the possibilities are actually very, very few as far as I know. But I think, being an historian, I have to at least say that I love the name because part of what we're intrigued about here is the Petrostate, and we know that it is a coined phrase, of course, coming from petroleum, but I think I have to suggest that since the first four letters are actually the Russian spelling of Peter the Great's name, that Petrostate has some perhaps meaning given the origins of some of the ideas, especially as it relates to the interaction with the West, with high technology, with great developmental issues that Peter the Great actually introduced in the country, or at least facilitated in many profound ways. It also is the first letters of the name of the city that figures prominently in this book and in the past of many of the prominent players that are major actors and players and leaders in the Petrostate, as Marshall has so wonderfully described it. One of the reviewers has said this is the book that is describing what has happened over this last decade, or really since the reemergence of Russia as this very significant energy powerhouse, and how that turns into political power and political action is the subject of the book, and then potential conversation and of course what we will all see as things develop. But with that, I certainly welcome Marshall Goldman here, and it's a privilege to be on the same sort of stage with you.
Thanks very much, Wayne. I don't think you knew it, but you set me up. When we were picking the title for the book, my agents had called it Petrostate, the first time I've ever had an agent. My wife said, no, people will think it means prostate, but it's, so that was not what Peter had in mind. And let me just say that it's a pleasure to be here, because this is the most exciting thing I've ever engaged in. And when I got this agent said, you know, you can't do this like your other books, because, you know, then you assign them as a textbook, and you told the students there would be an exam, and so they had to read it. Today, you're not teaching anymore. You can't give exams. So you've got to make it so people want to read it. But I said, if I do that, I'll lose my license as an economist. And I said, what in the world can I write about that would make it exciting? But then a year ago, we went off. I was invited to go to Russia. There's this meeting called the Valdai Hills Group. And they take us out. In the end, the climax is always meeting with Putin. And this time, the third year that we were doing it, we've done it 4 years now. The third year, we were going to go out. The theme was oil, and so they took us out to Siberia, to the Priobskaya field. I said, well, maybe I'll find something there. And I got there, and it was very interesting. But to write about it, it would have been forced. But then they took us to Gazprom headquarters. And those of you who've been to Moscow know that Gazprom headquarters are really this tall building striking in the southwest region of Moscow. And so I'm going to do something that I hate it when other people do, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's to read from my own book, which describes going into this building. When I start reading, people say, why does he have to read it? He hasn't read it before. But you may get a flavor, and this really kind of sets off this whole change in atmosphere, and I think this describes it as much as anything can. At first I was puzzled. Where were they taking us? For such a big, sleek glass Moscow high-rise, Gazprom's elevator in its headquarters building was tiny. 5 people could barely squeeze in. And its hall corridors were narrow, very narrow. This was, after all, the world's largest producer of natural gas, not to mention Russia's largest company. Following a short walk, we were ushered into a darkened, silent room where nothing seemed to be happening. Strange. It was only when all the members of our group had made their way up on those elevators that the room suddenly came alive. Then for a time I felt as if I'd wandered into a NASA Space Center. Or was it a James Bond movie set? All that was missing was that out-of-body voice intoning, "Welcome, Mr. Goldman. We were expecting you," if you've seen the James Bond. Okay, anyway, in front of me, covering the whole 100-foot wall of the room, was a map with a spider web-like maze of natural gas pipelines reaching from East Siberia west to the Atlantic and from the Arctic Ocean south to the Caspian and Black Seas. Manipulating this display were Gazprom dispatchers, 3 men controlling the flow of Gazprom's gas to East and West European consumers of this Russian natural gas monopoly. No wonder there was tight security. There was also a sense of self-assurance, as measured by the value of its corporate stock. By the summer of 2006, when we were there, Gazprom, and I know some of you have invested in it, this state-dominated joint stock corporation, and until 1992, it was actually the Soviet Ministry of the Gas Industry, had become the world's 3rd largest corporation. Only private shareholder-owned ExxonMobil and General Electric were larger. If you've been following it today, you know that actually it's number 2 now, because General Electric stock has fallen, and so it's the largest corporation in terms of capitalized value is ExxonMobil, and Gazprom is now number 2. And then one more sentence and I'm through. With a flick of a switch, those dispatchers sitting in this Moscow room could freeze and indeed have frozen entire countries. At the very least, they could send their citizens off in a panic in search of sweaters, scarves, and blankets. Well, for me, that sets the theme of this fascinating story. Less than 10 years ago, August 17th, 1998, Russia was effectively bankrupt. And you have tables in front of you. And if you look at them, the dark line...
Excuse me, this is where the economist comes in.
Well, don't fall asleep just yet. But if you look at the dark lines of GDP, then you can see what was happening from the early 90s, and indeed it begins in the late 80s. The Russian economy goes into a free fall. It drops in 1 year almost 16%. Cumulative. By 1998, there's a slight uptick in 1997, but by 1998, the cumulative fall is about 40%. That's worse than what we suffered in the Great Depression. So you can I want you to get a feel of how bad the Russian economy was doing, how humiliated the Russians were, because from being a superpower country, they had fallen into not being significant at all. They were bankrupt. Effectively bankrupt. On August 17th, 1998, the Russian country, as a country, declared that its bonds were worthless. They would not redeem their bonds. The stock market in Russia fell. The currency, the ruble, became worthless. There was no money in the treasury. There were echoes in this country, because some of you may remember with pain long-term capital management, a Greenwich, Connecticut hedge fund that basically collapsed. The Federal Reserve Bank had to come in to prop them up. Our own stock market, in response, fell 20%, and we were worried that we would go through a similar meltdown. So this is what they were facing. Now, what is significant here is that in 1999, you see that the GDP begins to go up, and it continues to go up. It's gone up every year since then. In August 1999, Yeltsin, who was the president then, presiding over this collapse, appoints Vladimir Putin as the prime minister. He becomes prime minister in August 1999. December 31st, he becomes the acting president because Yeltsin announces his premature resignation, and in March he's elected. Now, look, so from 1999 on now, the GDP begins to go up with just consistently. And so for the Russians, it's easy to understand. They associate Putin with nothing else. He comes into office, and the economy begins to respond, and Russia comes back, and the treasury is filled now. Russia has savings of in a sovereign fund of approximately $500 billion worth of gold, rubles, gold, not rubles, but gold and dollars and euros. The ruble has gained 20% value relative to the dollar. So they are floating, and so it's easy to understand why the Russian people say it's Putin who did it, and that if you take a public opinion poll, 80% of the Russian people say Putin is the one we support and we want to sustain. So the question is, to what extent, and this is what the book looks at, to what extent is this all due to Putin, and to what extent is it independent? And I'm old enough to know now that when I give lectures, people are awake the first 10 minutes. After a while, by the middle of the lecture, they're thinking, when's he going to end? And so they're not paying attention. By the end of the lecture, everybody races for the door. So I'll tell the answer now. So people said, what does he say? You know what the answer is. And the answer is, Putin did make a difference, but not because he didn't create this. What is created, and again, to give you that answer so you can think about other things, is you see the line adjacent to that dark line, and that shows the change in oil production. And this is most unusual in social science. Whenever oil production drops, GDP drops. And even in 1997, when it goes up a touch, GDP goes up. And thereafter, without fail, it's a perfect correlation. So that it's clear that oil production drives this. And so I tell my wife that, look, if I had been appointed Prime Minister of Russia in August 1999, and oil prices begin to go up, as they do, and oil production begins to go up, even I would look like a genius. So it's not, unless you can tell me that Putin is the reason oil production drops, and that oil prices drop, and then oil prices go up again, you can't really say that it's Putin's doing. It's really a case of oil, and that's why I call the book Petrostate. It's not Saudi Arabia. In fact, Russia has been producing more petroleum than Saudi Arabia. It's the largest producer of petroleum in the world. It's not the largest exporter. Saudi Arabia is, and Saudi Arabia is now again increasing production. But that is the explanation. So you can go home now, but you won't hear what Putin did. So let me now say, what difference did Putin make? Well, that goes to the next table. If you look at it, and Putin did make a difference. He didn't affect oil price changes. That, of course, is the market. And oil prices go from $10 a barrel to today, $140 a barrel. So you can, and it's that change in oil price which has led oil companies in Russia to go out into the extreme conditions, particularly in the Arctic, and begin to invest. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. The conditions are too extreme. So what did Putin do? Well, you know, Putin was trained as a lawyer, and then he joined the KGB, and then he went to East Germany, where he served as a KGB agent. But the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and there was he was unemployed. So he went back to Leningrad, as it was then called, and he got a job with one of his former law professors, a man by the name of Sobchak, who became the governor of St. Petersburg. And he put Putin in charge of foreign economic relations. That's what Wayne knows. This is what the KGB agent is always, you're dealing with, is always a KGB agent. But then Sobchak lost the election. And what to do? Again, Putin was unemployed. So what happened is, while he was in this kind of limbo in 1997, he decided to write a short dissertation. We have it. And what he does is he examines the question, what should Russia be doing to bring back its superpower status? What can we do? What do we have? We don't have manufacturing. Our military is discredited. It's bogged down in Chechnya. We don't have anything. The only thing we have going for us are our raw materials. And so he says, we've got to take those raw materials, many of which had been turned over to private companies, take them back, put them in control, and use them to promote Russia's interests. And so he adopts this notion of what he calls national champions. And the thesis has been available, it's been translated, and he calls for the creation of national champions. What we should do is go back and take over that gas, take over that oil, the ferrous metals, the non-ferrous metals, put them in entities which are controlled by the state, and use them to advance Russia's interests, just like ExxonMobil advances the United States interests. Now, there's a sidelight here. If this were fiction, you'd say, no, it couldn't be real, but this is real. It turns out that we know that Putin plagiarized that idea from two professors from Pittsburgh University. He took, as a whole, 10 to 15 pages, word for word, in Russian, of course, but their book had been translated into Russian. The next time you see Putin, you can ask him where did it come from. But it's, we can see
him.
I'm going to see him. We saw him in the guy who discovered this was a man by the name of Clifford Gotti. Even he didn't ask Putin this kind of thing, but it's there. And look at this table and see what happens. When he wrote this, it was just what you would write off as an academic exercise, which means it'll never come to fruition. Because this is 1997. Putin is now, in St. Petersburg, now just an ordinary administrator. There's no chance he's going to go to Moscow. If he does go to Moscow, how in the world is he going to be prime minister? Much less the president. But he does. He gets there, and look what happens. He's elected president on his own in March 2000. Immediately, he begins to implement this notion. And what has been happening is he is concerned by the fact that the people who had privatized these companies, including Gazprom, have been stripping assets, taking assets off from what were these companies not wholly owned by them, and transferring them to other companies that they controlled. Now, Chernomyrdin, who's first on this list, actually had been the minister of the gas industry in the Soviet era. He then becomes prime minister, and he leaves, and his deputy, if you go down fourth on the list, a man by the name of Yakharev, takes over, and he becomes the head of the CEO of Gazprom. They privatize the gas ministry, as I mentioned in the beginning, and they take over, and they begin to strip off assets. One of the companies they strip off assets to is a company called Itera. Now, the strangest thing is that Itera is located, you'd never guess, in Jacksonville, Florida. Why in Jacksonville, Florida? Why not? It's warmer. It's nicer.
Wonderful beach home.
And so Itera becomes the second largest producer of natural gas in Russia. And if you're if you're an energy company in the United States, what's the first thing you do? You get a lobbyist. So, like any red-blooded energy company, you've got to have a lobbyist in Washington. So they find a young woman, they pay her $500,000, and only by coincidence does it turn out that her father is a congressman. Not from Jacksonville, Florida, from Philadelphia. It's not too close, but you take them where you can get them. His name is Kurt Weldon. And Kurt Weldon becomes, in effect, the man from Itera related to Gazprom. And as far as we can tell, the ownership of Itera is very opaque, but it consists of the children of Chernomyrdin and Vyacherev, their wives, and as well as other senior executives and their mistresses. They're all there together. It's a nice, happy family. And Itera then now is here, and what do? Weldon is the man from Itera. He hosts them, and he has a reception for the executives from Itera at the Library of Congress. He goes to Jacksonville to help them dedicate their new offices. He arranges for an $800,000 grant from the Development Office, the U.S. Trade and Development Office, to help Itera develop natural gas deposits in Russia, which is not normally what U.S. organizations funded by the government are supposed to do. Then, as a subplot on a subplot, how do we know all this? Well, you may remember the Department of Justice, our U.S. Department of Justice, was accused of digging into dirt on various congressmen in order to increase the number of Republicans to defeat the Democrats. And indeed, Weldon loses the election in 2006 after the Department of Justice reveals all this information. The only trouble is Weldon is a Republican. Somebody got their signals mixed. They were supposed to go out after Democrats, You know, so you can see why this is also fascinating. And so now he's out, and indeed, ITRA no longer has its congressman. But what Putin is doing now is getting rid of these people because they've stolen assets from Russia. So he gets rid of Chernomyrdin, he gets rid of Yakarev, and then he goes out after the oil people here as well, bringing them back. They've been privatized. He goes after Berezovsky, taking back Sibneft, that's transferred to a company called Rosneft. And the one that we've heard most recently about at the bottom is Michael Khodorkovsky. He was the head of Yukos. He was Russia's richest man. He's now in prison in Siberia, serving 8 years, and he'll probably, unless the new president does something to change that, he'll be there till he dies, probably. So anyway, this is what's taken place. And then the next table, again in the book, who do you bring in when you get rid of these other guys? Who do you bring in? And so he brings in what the Russians have come to call Siloviki. Silo means strength, and you can translate this by saying these are the law and order types. In this country, it would be as if the senior executives of the FBI go into business after they retire, or the Pentagon generals go into business. The only thing in Russia, they're doing it simultaneously. If you look at this list, take Sechin, for example. And I actually asked Putin this question the last time we met. How can you have a situation where Sechin is the deputy administrator of the Kremlin, which is a very senior position, and that's his day job. Actually, he was then promoted to first deputy prime minister after that. But then on top of that, he's also the chairman of the board of Rosneft. Rosneft is now Russia's largest company. It's state-owned. For the most part, there are private shares in it, but it's state-owned. So here's a man who has two jobs. Both are full-time. How can he do them well? Besides which, how can you expect Sechin to be impartial if an issue of what should we do with energy companies comes up before the Kremlin? He can't rule against his own company. And besides which, you're going to create a new group of oligarchs. You're getting rid of the old oligarchs. You get rid of Berezovsky. You got rid of Khodorkovsky, but you're bringing in new people. And more than that, if you look down at the bottom, they're doing something that never happened in the Soviet era. They're creating the children of the executives are being put in these cushy jobs. In the Soviet era, they may have gone into think tanks, academic institutions, but not making money. So look at the bottom. That's probably the biggest embarrassment. Patrushev, who was the head of the KGB, has two sons. One goes to work for Vnestorg Bank, which is a state bank, and the other is for Rosneft, the company we've just been talking about. So you can see there's going to be all kinds of conflict of interest, all kinds of new wealth being created or being transferred to these executives. So today, in fact, according to Forbes magazine, Russia has the second largest number of billionaires, second only to the United States. We still do some things right. We still have more billionaires than anybody else. But they've just eclipsed Germany to become number 2. New York actually used to have the largest number of billionaires. Now Moscow has more than New York, which again is a reflection of this change, of this new wealth that's being created. So these people are clearly very loyal to Putin. They've also enriched themselves along the way. And in the process, of course, Russia has benefited enormously. Now, I'll just end this with a look at the last table. I said, in doing work, just my research, I said, I really should get some idea of how important Russia is for the supply of oil and gas to Europe. So I went to the library, I went to Litauer Library, and I gathered the information from the International Energy Authority Agency's handbook. And I went back to my office and I put this table together, and I said, this is really startling, and the rest of the world should be aware of it, and so I decided I would write the book. This gives you some feel for it. Look at Germany. Germany gets 42% of its natural gas now from Russia. And that's just enormously important. The oil, if oil is cut off, it'll be inconvenient. You'll have to go elsewhere, and you'll have to pay more to get it. But if Venezuela, for example, should cut us off, well, there are other places we can go. We are indeed already importing petroleum from Russia, about $10 billion worth. It'll take a while. It'll be more expensive, but we can find another tanker. We can find another pipeline. We can find another railroad car, another tank truck. But with natural gas, that's really like an umbilical cord, because it all comes out of the pipeline. The pipeline costs $3 to $6 billion. You can't have a standby pipeline just in case they cut it off. So you put all your money in that pipeline. You can't have capital just sitting there idle for $3 to $6 billion. And sooner or later there may be liquefied natural gas, but even that requires at least $1 billion expenditure to process the gas, to transport it with special tankers, and then to reprocess it again. So if you've got that pipeline up, you've got them politically in a stranglehold. And in my mind, it has already begun to influence what Germany is doing, because the Germans have to calculate. It's not worth it to rile the Russians over smaller issues in fear that they will cut us off for one reason or another. And if you look at this list, you can see that even Italy is very heavily dependent on Russia, even though it's at the end of the pipeline. It's more, in the west and the south. I mean, the east and the south. No, the west and the south. But they're going to be affected too. And France. And if you go to Eastern Europe, Central Europe, you see they get 100% of their natural gas. And that's going back to that first page that I read. You can see why that sets the theme for everything that follows. It's really critical that it has a political hold. I say we too are in a position now in the United States where we are also becoming more and more dependent on Russia. For me, it's good at this point because it's petroleum. We are importing on the order now of about $700 million worth of petroleum a year. 10 of it is coming from Russia. But that helps to diversify. So the more sources of supply there are, that's fine. It means the Russians build up money because they've got this favorable trade balance. So that's why they went from bankruptcy 10 years ago to a treasury now that holds over $500 billion worth of assets.
Almost 600 now.
And that makes them the third in the world after China and Japan. But again, in less than a decade, from bankruptcy to affluence, that's filtering down to the public, so there's new prosperity. But it's the gas which doesn't bring in that much money, but does give them that political clout. And that's what it seems to me is important for the rest of the world to understand. And this gives them a new hubris, a new arrogance, as it were. And I will just end this rant by showing you, trying to reflect how Russia is back and how they now feel their power and their strength in a variety of ways. Last February 2007, at a press conference, Putin was asked about George Bush. The two of them have a very unusual relationship. In the 4 times I've met with Putin, each time he brings up George W. Bush, in the most complimentary way, unsolicited comments. The last time around, for example, Putin said he really appreciated George Bush because George Bush went off to the G8 meeting that took place in St. Petersburg. There was a lot of criticism of that. There was pressure for him not to go within the United States, without the United States. Putin said Bush came, and he appreciated that. I've met with George Bush once, and he, too, has positive things to say about Putin, although a little more critical. But, the two of them, their body language is absolutely phenomenal. So they really get along with each other. Anyway, so Putin is asked at this press conference, how do you get along with George Bush? And so he says, I can do business with George Bush. And I said to myself, gee, I heard something like that before. Where had I heard that? Well, this is what, remember, Margaret Thatcher said about Mikhail Gorbachev before Gorbachev became the general secretary. In a very patronizing way, what she was saying, yes, I can do business with that peasant from Stavropol. Now it's turned around, and what is Putin saying? Yes, I can do business with that cowboy from Crawford. I mean, it's just, again, in a patronizing. And here I'll absolutely end with another press conference. This was in June, just a year ago. Putin is asked by a correspondent from Der Spiegel. He says, Mr. President, former federal chancellor Gerhard Schroeder called you a pure Democrat. Do you consider yourself as such? Well, just as an interject here, as you can say many things about Putin, but a pure Democrat, just no way. Anyway, Putin answers, and I read the transcript. He laughs. Am I a pure Democrat? Of course I am, absolutely. But you know what the problem is? It's not even a problem. It's a real tragedy. The problem is that I'm all alone, the only one of my kind in the whole wide world. Just look at what's happening in North America. Again, let me interject. He's going to turn the world on its head. Look what's happening in North America. All true, but listen. It's simply awful. Torture, homeless people, Guantanamo, people detained without trial and investigation. Just look at what's happening in Europe. Harsh treatment of demonstrators, rubber bullets and tear gas used first in one capital, then in another. Demonstrators killed in the streets. All true. But for God's sakes, man, look in the mirror. You know, all of these things are exactly what has happened in Russia. And then he ends, and this is the climax. There's no one to talk to since Mahatma Gandhi died.
Well, thank you, Marshall. Well, maybe some of those comments do indicate why the man has the power that he has today, if he's able to say such things, and in his case, always with a straight face. One of the things that intrigues me both about the book and about the reality too is the centrality of Gazprom, this large company that now, just in the last week, Alexei Miller, who is the new CEO, claims that shortly it will become a $1 trillion company. It will be the largest corporation in the world, not only through their distribution of gas and the sale around the world, but by very significant investments in downstream things. This is Gazprom, so much so that some funny folks have called the country, instead of Russia, we should call it Gazpromistan, and run by Gazputin. But the jokes aside, Gazprom is central to this thing, and yet I think I'm correct that we haven't mentioned yet the former chairman of Gazprom, who is now president of the country.
Yes.
How is this bridge, if all you lay out is right, and it's right there in the book and in the press, I think it's pretty obvious what Gazprom has done, but how is that bridge going to happen, and how is Putin going to either maintain control, or what will this new relationship be? Because it's not the same as it was before.
I'm glad. I should have mentioned that, and you're absolutely right to ask me about it. If you go back to this table with the Siloviki again, if you look down, you will find Medvedev's name. He was one of these two people serving dual jobs. He was the chairman of the Kremlin administration. Then he became one of the first deputy prime ministers, simultaneously holding on to the job as chairman of the board of Gazprom. And it's actually, he only left that position just 2 or 3 days ago, so he was doing both. There's no doubt, this is why it's a national champion. Gazprom is serving this. Putin himself, in one of our meetings, said that he envisions the day when Gazprom will be a $1 trillion corporation, just as you mentioned it. They see their well-being as a country, economically as well as politically, being intermingled with Gazprom. So Medvedev now is the president, and how can he forget his past? He too is going to be on a list of oligarchs in a very short period of time. Indeed, I say, this is why Russia now has more than anybody else but the United States in terms of billionaires. But clearly Medvedev will have those interests, and there's no hiding the fact that it kind of carries the flag. And it carries the flag in terms of wealth. I mean, I've spoken to some of the people in this room before the session started, and Americans have invested in Gazprom too. It's been a very profitable investment. In year 2000, its capitalized value was about $6 to $8 billion. Today, it's about $400 billion. As I say, the second largest in Russia. And on the way, if Putin has his way as prime minister, and certainly Medvedev has his way, to $1 trillion.
There are people here in this room also who are engaged in one way or another in business or business activities, or interested in business that is being conducted in Russia. One of the questions is, what are they going to do with all this money? The wealth creation is very apparent. You just do the math. The question is, what are they going to use this for? Just for political purposes. I think you pointed out in the book that even at a 7% growth in GDP, they're not going to be able to reestablish themselves as a military power. Putin believes that too, and their principal economist in Russia all say that. So what are they going to do with this massive amount of money? Do they have the capability, first of all, to handle it, and then what will they use it for?
Great question. They're using it in part. They said initially, Putin brought some of the economic advisors he was working with in St. Petersburg to Moscow, and these were more or less professional economists. They said, look, we've got to isolate this money. It'll kill us otherwise because we'll have inflation. It'll flood the country. So they put it in a stabilization fund for a while. But now they're getting antsy, and political pressures where we should be spending. Some of it, our highways are in bad shape, our infrastructure is in bad shape. We should be giving more support to the elderly. But in addition to that, particularly the money that goes to the corporations, because the oil money in particular is going to the corporations first of all, it is being used to buy up other companies, right here in River City. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Lukoil, which is now one of their second or third largest oil companies, it's privately held, has bought up what used to be Getty Oils. Of those of you who are used to traveling along the East Coast, the Northeast Coast, New Jersey, New York, you will find where Getty oil stations were, they are now Lukoil. Now, I also have to say that ConocoPhillips owns 20% of Lukoil, so they own 20% of Lukoil. Lukoil owns all of Getty, and they're all together going into Iraq, where Lukoil was operating before. But so this is to buy companies. And then if you look at the steel industry, it's even more dramatic in the steel industry. Severstal, which is a Russian company, has bought up a whole network of American steel companies. From my point of view, again, it's terrific because Americans aren't investing in steel industry. Let somebody do it, and the Russians are coming and actually bringing some of their technology, which is ironic because in our earlier days we used to watch American companies take our technology to Russia. Now the Russians are bringing the technology back. They bought up Oregon Steel. Another Russian steel company bought up Oregon Steel in Oregon, the River Rouge plant in Detroit, Sparrows, they're in Baltimore. So they're just
and Jackson, Mississippi.
And Jack, that's right. They've just bought something in Jackson, and also Wheeling Steel. So there's just a whole network of things. Our one platinum producer in Montana, they've bought these up, and they're doing the same thing, of course, in Europe. The Russians are coming literally this way, which is quite a dramatic thing. And what is also interesting is that where in Europe there's some nervousness, particularly as they begin to buy up gas companies, distribution companies. So far, there's not been much of a fuss in the United States because we welcome that investment. If somebody wants to invest in our steel industry, come on, please do it. So that's been helpful. But politically, it could be a problem down the road.
But if you use all that capital for investment, then what are you doing internally because of the infrastructure you're talking about, and even reinvestment in the infrastructure of the oil and gas industry itself is of great concern, or could be. There's a bunch of money. How are they going to invest that and also shore up their own domestic situation and produce things? We talk about the Dutch disease, and when you have these natural resources, you stop doing manufacturing, you stop doing things internal to country. What are they going to do?
The oil prosperity has come at a price, and the price, as you say, is the Dutch disease. One of the things that has happened, what is the Dutch disease? The Dutch disease, you bring in all this money that comes in from your export of energy, oil or gas. That pushes up the value of the ruble, and I think I said the ruble has increased 20% relative to the dollar, which means the ruble is very expensive, and if things are priced in rubles, that makes them very expensive to buy. So what happens? You don't buy them. So the export of manufacturing goods has never been good. It's not good now. But it also means that for the Russian consumers, the ruble is strong. They can buy a lot. They can buy a lot of goods from the United States because we're cheap now. Our goods are very cheap because the dollar is weak. And so while your economy is growing with all this money coming in, you're killing your manufacturing sector. And that's what the Dutch disease was. And they worry about that. But at the same time, and if you, please don't ask me because I puzzled about it and I can't find the answer. you see the money coming down on the street, at least in the cities. How it gets there, because they're not manufacturing, is a bit of a mystery. Services, yes, are very, very prosperous, a lot of service activities, and you can do it that way. But manufacturing is bad. Some of the manufacturing, where it is good, is protected by tariffs that the Russians have put up. So there are now almost every automobile manufacturer now is assembling automobiles in St. Petersburg. American, German, Japanese, other Europeans, because all this disposable income has just been flooding in the country. It's growing at 10–15% a year. But if Russia ever joins the World Trade Organization, that means they'll have to lower the tariffs, and that industry will be destroyed. So it's a bit of a problem. But I do have to say one thing. I want to say something positive about Putin, because on the whole, I've not said much, if anything, about it.
So he'll invite you back, you know.
Well, you never know, you know. But I mean, he deserves credit for this, legitimately. At one of our meetings, somebody asked him, "What's your greatest accomplishment?" You know, after 4 meetings, the questions get rather soft, and he said, "One of the things I'm proudest of is that when I came into office in 2000, again, the country had hit bankruptcy." He said over a third of the population, 33% of the public, was below the poverty line. Today it's 14 to 15%. So somehow or other, some of that money is filtering down, and it's not because they changed the definition of the poverty line. You can really see traffic jams in Russia, construction, shops that are filled with goods. Again, in our day, the shelves were empty, literally empty. And now they've got not only, they import them, but, consumer goods and luxury goods. Of course, this says maybe some more about Boston than it says about Moscow, but there are luxury shops in Moscow that Boston doesn't compare at all. Well, people say Boston is rather shabby to begin with, but here you really see
part of the mystique.
Part of the mystique. But here, you see. They were selling more Mercedes automobiles in Moscow than any other car, and more than any other capital city except for Germany itself. So that's a reflection of that.
So we do have that. Well, I think it is time we need to open this up. We've got quite some time that we want to take for people to ask questions. Remember, please raise your hand and get the mic. I'll start on the front row. That's a good place to start with John Wood.
Great fan. Professor Goldman, I want to go back and in a way play devil's advocate in terms of those that are in the energy industry will first and foremost point out that 80% of what is being extracted is from West Siberia, and 8% in natural gas, 93% in oil, and that essentially within the next 3 to 4 years there will be somewhere between a 15 to 20% drop in the production from there. And therefore there is an issue of whether it's peaked. Articles even in the EIA about the questioning the estimations by Gazprom. And so it raises the issue of, are they going to be there? Is this just an Indian summer? The other side is, obviously, they need our help. And then it comes into this whole area of the macroeconomic environment of resource nationalism, which has a regressive tax system, the mineral extraction tax, for example, and then obviously the recent foreign strategic law, which seemed to suggest, on the one hand, a desire, and President Putin, when he was president, and Medvedev have said, come in, but on the other hand, you've got this very regressive tax regime. Yes, there have been some reductions in order to incentivize the issue of oil. So you've got this issue of, is this real anyway? And many people in the oil and gas industry pointing to the fact, well, the fact is they've not got to East Siberia yet. The seismic issues and exploration issues are enormous. The other side is the enormous investment that would be required. They're going to need, even if they've got about $1 trillion, they're going to need $2 to $3 trillion to develop the Nord Stream, South Stream, Espo, Shotkaman, East Siberia, Sakhalin. And so you've got, on the one hand, an enormous need for money, and we obviously have enormous need of dependency. But on the other hand, a number of impediments at a macroeconomic level that constrain us from going forward. What do you think, first of all, of the peak oil argument that's gone forward? Do you think they'll get to East Siberia and the Far East before the plunger drops. And on the other hand, the whole tax and legal framework, when you have issues like Shell being thrown out of Sakhalin, the TNBK over Kofotka, it's not sort of, even though you want to be there, do you want to be there?
Gee, I feel like I've just had my general examination for my PhD. Great questions. I'm glad I'm dealing with a group that doesn't know anything about energy. That's also very reassuring. Well, this is something they were. But first, let me go back a little bit, and I talk about it in the book. Actually, just these, believe it or not, these questions. First of all, back in the 1970s, the CIA, our CIA, came out with a report saying that Russia, which was then the world's largest producer of petroleum, would suddenly become one of the world's largest importers of petroleum by the mid-1980s. Because they were using drilling methods that were destructive, and they were ruining the whole thing. I came up, my first book on energy was that, saying that the CIA was wrong, which was a pretty gutsy thing to do at the time, because it just seemed to me illogical. Well, it turned out that so far I've been right, although if you look at this table, in the early 90s, when production is going down, maybe their day had come. But what happened? Oil prices went up. And when oil prices went up, then they decided, okay, it was worth doing that investment. And so then they hit this new peak where, again, Russia becomes the largest producer of petroleum. Even Saudi Arabia cuts back a little bit, so larger than Saudi Arabia. This year, this quarter, first quarter of this year, it's gone down again. And that hits right to the point that you made. One of the deputy CEOs of Lukoil made a public speech in which he said, oil production is going down, and you'd better be aware, the country better be aware of it, and the government better be aware of it, because if this continues, we may have hit it, and it's going down again. Well, of course, for me, this brought back memories right away of the CIA. And of course, he said, why is it going down? It's going down for the reasons that you mentioned. When oil prices reach $27 a barrel, an 80% tax kicks in, which is confiscatory. And so this executive from Lukoil said, you want us to go out into East Siberia, there's no infrastructure there, at those prices with that retained earnings after taxes, it doesn't pay. Putin got the message. And Putin says, okay, if you want to go out into new areas where there's no infrastructure, you're immune from, there's a tax holiday. You're immune from that. So it's still going to be out there. The investment indeed is enormous, as you say. I just was in Moscow about 2 or 3 weeks ago, consulting, whatever you want to call it, with Statoil. Statoil is a Norwegian company that after having been told it would not have an opportunity to develop Stockman, was invited back in. And so now they're examining this question, what should we do, how should we proceed? Because if we put in money, are we going to end up discovering that we're going to be abused by the Russians, as Shell Oil has, as ExxonMobil has, as BP has, as everybody has who's in there? I'm not sure they'll be able to escape that. But my point is this: they bring in Statoil, which is a Norwegian company, because they've got experience dealing in the Arctic. So they're now developing the Stockman, which is in the Arctic Circle. The Russians have also announced that they sent in an underwater submarine. Well, underwater submarines. Where do submarines go? I mean, underneath the polar cap, to go to the North Pole, to put a plaque there saying this is ours. So they're claiming this territory. There's a lot out there that's there. Part of it has to do with the tax regime. Part of it has to do to bring in foreign companies. The bigger question, and the one that fascinates me, is why companies like Shell, like every major company, ConocoPhillips got smart and said, we'll hold our investment to 20%, because when you get above that, then you begin to make Putin nervous. And BP made a mistake, a 50-50 investment in a joint venture, and Shell made some mistakes too. They went in to develop Sakhalin, which is an island off the Pacific, which is, again, very difficult working conditions. They went in and they say, well, we will have an arrangement whereby we will be able to get all our investment back before you, the government, get any money. And we think it'll be $10 billion because it's going to be very difficult. It turns out, they say now it's $20 billion. The Russians, that means we won't ever see our money, and you're going to be taking our resources, you're going to be making it, and we won't. And so they then basically pushed Shell out they brought in a new partner, Gazprom. And so in these circumstances, you have to be sensitive to the fact that the Russians treat this as their holy of holies, and if you look like you're doing something at their expense, you're going to court trouble. But I asked these oil companies executives, why are you doing this? You know you're going to get caught in this whipsaw sooner or later. And they say, well, look, where are we going to go? Okay, it's been suggested we go to Peru, and there's the shining path. If we have to deal with the shining path, we'd rather deal with the KGB and Gazprom. If those are our alternatives. And so God did not put oil in nice places, and we have to deal on that basis. And so they know it, and I think the Russians feel they can do it. And also in terms of gas, that what I argue in the book is that they also can control what's going on in Central Asia, and Putin has handled that very well. Here he really is the man from Gazprom. If somebody else, Dick Cheney, goes to Kazakhstan and tries to tell the people in Kazakhstan that they should support the building of a bypass gas pipeline under the Caspian Sea to avoid Russia, Putin flies there the next day. You don't want to do that. And that's a pie in the sky. You're going to put money in that. It'll never come to reality. We're here. We're real. Stick with us. And basically sabotages it.
Alexei Miller, the CEO of Gazprom, has said again in a recent interview just this last week, part of his advice is we welcome the investment. You just better invest with a state company, and you better do it at a percentage that is acceptable, and that's probably a moving target. Next question.
Yeah, John Stremlaw of Marshall, thanks for a great talk. Could you reflect a little bit on the triangle of Russia, China, and the U.S.? And are you and Merrill going to have something to say on that soon?
Yeah, I should say my wife is a China specialist. That's a fascinating triangle, too. The Russians are very nervous because, as you know, we've just heard, as Wayne indicated, there's more and more movement to develop energy in East Siberia, which is, of course, just in the maritime provinces, and that's where there are lots of Chinese. More than that, the Russians from that part of the area, Vladivostok, are moving to the west. On top of that, if that weren't enough, the biggest problem that Putin probably has to deal with, or Medvedev, the new president, is the fact that the Russian population is shrinking. It's falling 700,000 people a year. It's not unique. It's happening in Europe to many countries as well. But it means that when there are, say, 6 to 8 million Russians in Siberia and in the maritime provinces on the Pacific, and there are 30, 40 million Chinese eager to cross the border, that makes them nervous. And you go there, we've traveled a lot there, and what you find is construction crews are more and more Chinese. You go into the markets, you find the Chinese are the ones selling their goods from across the border. This causes a lot of local racism, anger, xenophobia. Indeed, that there are laws now pushing out the foreigners, not just the Chinese, but the Central Asians as well from some of their markets. But it's a problem, and it creates tension. At the same time, the two of them, Russia and China, have linked up together in joining the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which also brings in the Central Asian, against the United States. And this, I think, is a shortcoming of our foreign policy, that we've done things that have brought them together in a way that normally they wouldn't be together, because naturally, if left to their own, there would be problems. The Chinese did help the Russians in the sense that they came in and bought lots of military equipment. But this provoked a big debate in Russia. It was as if, Lenin was supposed to have said it, we don't know if he did, that the capitalists will sell us the rope that will hang them. And so what the Russians were saying, we're selling the military equipment that may come back to haunt us. The Chinese say, no, we're going to use it against Taiwan, but they've come together this way. So there is a lot of natural rivalry that's there that could indeed cause lots of problems.
But in the context of political interaction and engagement and even rivalry, this makes sense. They're concerned. Russians have to be concerned about this. This goes back 1,000 years of concern about what's coming out of the East. On the other hand, from a purely commercial point of view, if you look at it as Russia Inc. or Gazprom Inc. or Rosneft, you said this week in another interview with Russians media that there's also India. I mean, from a commercial standpoint, China and India are the two other enormously growing economies. So you've got a commercial interest and a political interest, and the question is, how do those tie together?
Well, in the case of India at this point, although India's become much closer to us recently, but before Russia and India were pretty close. Again, but partly as a play against China. Now this is, again, India is part of this thing, but there is another aspect which is drawing both the Russians and the Chinese together, and that's the Islamic thing. Because the Chinese have a problem in Xinjiang, which is in northwest China. There've been violence, terrorism there because there's a very strong Islamic Chinese group, the Uyghurs, that are there, and they want independence. And we were there 2 years ago in Urumqi, which is one place where the Chinese actually produce some petroleum. And they were about to mark the celebration of the incorporation of Xinjiang into China, which the Uyghurs were not happy about. And there were soldiers, Chinese soldiers, parading in the markets, in the streets, with open bayonets, just because they were worried about this thing. So the Russians are concerned about this. In Kazakhstan, they're worried about this. Uzbekistan, they're worried about, and that was also partly the thing that the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement was to draw them together. And to some extent, to the extent that we get back in there, we say, this is something we have a mutual interest in this. So there are areas where they indeed have mutual concerns, but underlying it, there is potential, and historic, as you say, rivalry that on occasion has led to violence. The Russians, the Soviets, and the Chinese were shooting at each other in 1969.
In the back, please. And next will be here.
Thank you very much. Is the price of natural gas still subsidized in Russia? I mean, does it sell below, you might say, the market price in Western Europe?
Yeah.
And what is the outlook that natural gas prices inside of Russia will go up?
This has provoked a big debate in Russia because one of the things that should happen, this is our natural gas, Russia's natural gas. There should be some benefit to the population. Are you going to charge world prices and push us out of the market? So for a long time, the price of petroleum as well, but especially natural gas, was heavily subsidized, or at least it did not meet what the world market price was. For example, they were selling natural gas to Germany at $150 a thousand cubic meters. Inside Russia, it was about $40, $50. And also they were selling it at the same price to some of the former republics, Ukraine in particular. And that later set off a big battle with Ukraine because the Russians said, you're no longer part of us, you should be paying world prices too. And that's when they began to cut back the flow of gas to Ukraine, which in turn cut it off to Russia. If the big problem is while you want to subsidize your local public, and if you raise the price, you're going to have political protests, and you're going to get all kinds of difficulty that way. So you don't want to do that. But at the same time, unless you do price it at the world price, and here's the economists coming in, you're going to get wasteful use of it. Even free love, after a while, you begin to waste those resources, and so you want to have a proper price for that. So this was an argument, and Putin ultimately agreed, the Duma ultimately agreed, they would gradually begin to raise the price to the world market, as depending on what kind of price Gazprom was getting it generally. So this is already beginning to happen. Of course, the trouble is world energy prices keep going up. So you say, well, we'll bring it up to the level of 2006, but we're pretty far beyond that. But the goal is within the next a year or two to make it comparable to indeed make sure that it's used efficiently, and if nothing else, to make sure there's something to export. So it's a problem they recognize, and it's one that they seem to be coping with. And so far, there haven't been these protests that if they did it all at once, probably would happen. But the trouble is you're chasing a moving target
and
here.
the President has also said, Medvedev, that he wants to develop industry. Well, if you're going to develop indigenous industry, you must have energy to supply those factories. I think I promised you, please.
I'd like to use a mic. Oh, thank you. We are talking about much wealth, which would imply ownership. What is the status of the legal system in terms of private property rights? Have there been any reforms done?
Yeah. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. My previous book was called The Privatization of Russia, which really looked at this kind of thing. And this is in some ways an extension of that. You can own private property. And so the companies have been private. They took the ministry of the petroleum industry and broke it up into all these different companies, although Rosneft, the state still owned the majority of shares in Rosneft. Gazprom, at one point, state ownership fell to 38%. Putin saw this could be a problem, that it could be taken over by foreigners, and so he's pushed it back up. So the state now owns 51% of Gazprom. So, but you can own private shares in it. The trouble is, if you cross the state, I mean, if you counter whatever Putin wants, Putin gets. If you don't do that, then you run the risk of having visits from a whole variety of things. The internal tax people. You know, we had something like this in the United States under Nixon. You got visits from the IRS if you were doing something that the government, and that was one of the reasons why this led to the impeachment.
The Russians call it the creative use of administrative resources.
That's right.
That's a wonderful
yes.
phrase.
Just like they did in East Germany.
Yes. Well, it's the same notion of the communists. But here the variety. You know, it's not just limited to the tax people. The tax people went out after Khodorkovsky and Yukos. But now what is happening is that BP and Shell got visits from the pollution people. They violated pollution. They were polluting. Although if you've ever been in a Russian oil field before this new era, the Russian companies, Soviet companies, were notorious for the way they wasted resources because it was underpriced. It was just a terrible violation of nature. But one way or another, if they want you, they're going to get you. And you go into this. That's why should we go to the shining path? You come in and you're going to take your knocks. For me, it's humiliating, and I've just written something more just about this, where the president of Shell Oil, operating in Sakhalin, says, okay, it's not $10 billion our expenses are, it's $20 billion, and then he is told, you've violated the environmental rules, and unless you agree to I'm going to make you a proposition you can't refuse, like, out of The Godfather. Unless you agree to that, we're going to take over the whole company. So they agree to let Gazprom come in at a fraction. Gazprom bought it for about $6-7 billion. Already, Shell has put in $10 billion, and the chairman of Shell Oil says, "We're happy. Hit me again. We're happy for this kind of thing." But you play out. It's their baseball. It's their baseball bat. It's their baseball field. It's their baseball glove. And you want to operate, you've got to have just simply allow for. They can still confiscate it. They can still confiscate it, and this is what Khodorkovsky, every one of the oligarchs knows that this could happen.
I'll take something from the other side. Well, you had your hand up a long time behind. Go ahead, and then we'll come back to
Dr. Goldman. In the 90s, Gazprom and most of the Russian manufacturing were still based upon an allocation type of system, and a lot of their entrance into the Western world was using variable pricing. And it seemed that fixed pricing investment just wasn't part of their vocabulary. Has that changed from what you're seeing, that they understand the need for long-term investments and fixed priced issues?
Yes, they have indeed signed these long-term contracts. But like other energy companies, if prices go up as much as they have, there are ways of convincing you that maybe we should make an adjustment in what is happening. There's a fire in the pipeline, something goes wrong. So while they indeed are happy to sign these long-term contracts, they usually now smart enough to know that there are other things that they should allow for some kind of adjustment mechanism there. And, you know, in fairness to them, if this is the world price, why should you be locked in there forever? So they're not taking a beating. Where Gazprom is taking a beating, and somebody had mentioned it here earlier in the discussion, is that because it's a national champion, that means that the state works on your behalf externally, and you carry the flag, but it also means that you have commitments internally. And by that, it means Putin has said, hey, we're going to have the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Sochi, and we've got to have somebody finance the building of this. I think that would be a good project for you to undertake. No commercial relevance for it, taking the resources that are being generated elsewhere and using them in a whole series of infrastructure projects that should be rightfully the domain of the state, not of a private company. So, you know, that's where Gazprom has its problems. But in terms of contracts, as far as I know, they're still doing okay, and they're managing to get long-term prices that are adjustable one way or another, so that they don't suffer this way.
If I might take a prerogative of what's really the other side of not taking a prerogative, since I'm only president-elect, Peter had his hand up, we better let the still current president of Southern Center ask a question.
I feel like Putin here. About the oil.
If you have a country that has 34 million Muslims and a population of something less than 130 million, you have birth rates in free fall, you have a mortality rate which is dropping almost to Soviet standards, and you've got problems like you've indicated with the Chinese, is it not possible that one day the Russian authorities might look at the United States as possibly a very viable ally, because, you know, they're going to be outflanked. You can't have a great nation unless you have people, and they don't have and will not have the people.
Well, you know, I mentioned earlier that Putin, Russia's problem, biggest problem right now. Well, so many. The list is pretty long, but one near the top is the fact that it shrinks 700,000 people a year. And if you look at a population tree, one of the diagrams I pass out in other lectures is the population tree, which is normally a kind of a pyramid or a triangle, where what you do is you take people by age. After 1 year of age, some people die, so that shrinks until you get up to the 60s. And life expectancy now for Russian men is about 58, 59. So if we were doing this right now in Moscow, there would be very few of us in the room. I mean, that's so women. It's a little longer. And worst of all, when Yeltsin took over, people just stopped having children. So as you mentioned, and so the population tree looks something like this. It looks like I don't know what it looks like, but it comes up and then it goes up like this. And unless Putin can come up with some way of having women give birth to 12-year-olds, you're never going to fill this here. So the number of people who are entering the workforce now, because that's this area here, is very low. That also means the army. That also means that you're not going to have people for the military, and so the population thing is real.
Also about the HIV.
Well, that's why one of the reasons why life expectancy is so short, 58, 59. Alcoholism, smoking has dropped a little bit, but traffic accidents. One of our sessions with Putin, he was asked about this, And he said, well, if you live to 65, you're okay, but you've got to be able to survive those traffic deaths, the alcoholism. Then once you're 65, your life expectancy would be like it is in other countries. But we can't get people up there. And so Putin, recognizing this, has reintroduced programs that used to be prominent in the Soviet era, where you give big bonuses to women who have lots of children. But marriage is also a problem. I mean, it's somewhat like the United States now. There are fewer people, more and more people are having children out of wedlock, which is not a good way to bring up children. And so they're worried about this, and so he's got his hands full this way, and it does indeed suggest that Putin's aspirations. I think he has aspirations to be a super military power. The trouble is the military right now is not in a position to do it, and their draftees aren't going to be there, and there are all ways of getting out of the draft. There are all kinds of other things. They torture the draftees in ways. The suicide rate among draftees is one of the highest rates in the world, because they just can't take the hazing. It's just everything that could go wrong they do. So the population thing is clearly something that is a nightmare that Putin has to deal with, and his successor has to deal with.
The mic here for this.
Peter, one of the solutions I heard to Russia's declining population is that since China has a surplus of men and Russia has a surplus of women, that you're going to find the average couple be an older Russian woman with a younger Chinese husband. And I read that somewhere, but I can't give you the source. Professor Goldman, back to the conversation that we had briefly during the reception about Iran, referring to the Islamic question. I'm really quite worried about Russia having provided Iran with technology for nuclear power that has dual use, and not having made agreements to get back the spent fuel up front, which I don't think they did, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And it's a little bit late to lock the barn right now. Couldn't they be doing more to restrain Iran from developing nuclear weapons? Because it will activate Russia's Muslims. Don't they understand that?
Actually, it's an interesting question. The Russians are aware of this. Putin is aware of this. Putin is, whatever you want to say about Putin, he's not a dummy. And he's very conscious of this thing. In fact, the last visit we had to this group that goes over there, and we meet with them at the end, really was looking at a Russian, the Islamic question. And they took us to Kazan, which is the head of the capital of the Tatar Republic inside Russia. And we spent a lot of time going to the mosque, a lot of time going to the Russian Orthodox Church, hearing both the local imam and the local patriarch there talk about how well they're getting along with each other. So this is something they really are worried about, and they're very sensitive to. There was a time when, to his credit, Putin said, okay, we're going to stop the construction of that reactor, because the Russians did not have the guarantee they were looking for. I've heard from American diplomats in Moscow that they are satisfied with the sharing of intelligence that the Russians have provided with the United States. It's not so much Iran that the Russians worry about, although if there's a problem, they're much closer to Iran than we are in this country. It's Afghanistan, and the Russians have had their experience in Afghanistan. It's their Vietnam, or if you want, their Iraq, if you will. And they were just one of the reasons for this whole collapse was that they just ran aground in Afghanistan. So they appreciate that. And again, one of I think the merits of this Bush-Putin relationship is that has served as one of the areas where they do cooperate. So in answer to your question, yes, there's much more I would like Russia to do. But again, unlike what it was in the Soviet era, where, in the case of Iraq, for example, even under Gorbachev, the Russians purposely did everything they could to expand not just the civilian use of nuclear energy, but military use of energy as a way of provoking us, as a way of harassing us. And that's not happening now. there's not that kind of rivalry, provocation that existed earlier. A lot more could be done, and I would hope that it would be, but it's not as bad as it could be.
I hope you'll press them when you go over there.
Sure.
Cedric, please.
Professor Goldman.
The mic, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Goldman, you've alluded to the poor state of manufacturing, but could you say something more about the general state of the economy and how well it's functioning?
Yeah.
The banking system, credit systems, smaller shops, other forms of business, because you sort of get the feeling that there is this huge amount of wealth floating around, but at the same time, the rest of the economy is a real question mark.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Overall, you know, all this money flowing in covers a lot of problems. It masks a lot of problems. And all that oil revenue, but you know, as I said before, all that oil revenue means you can, or as Wayne said, you have the Dutch disease, so manufacturing suffers. But the bigger problem is corruption. The bigger problem is that there's no tradition of independence from the government. So for me, the biggest index or marker of Russia's, the state of the health of Russian economy is what is the role of small business? Can you start small business? What is the role of innovation? And there it's very dismal. The share of small business in the GDP in Russia is 10 to 15%. Whereas in this country, it's 50% or more. In Europe, it's about that high. I mean, as somebody whose son was an entrepreneur who's indeed sold his business to a company here in Atlanta, I'm very much a proponent of small business and watching innovation. And Russia, innovation, you start up. The minute that I did some interviewing along these lines with people who'd set up their own business. The minute that you put an ad in the paper that you're doing well or that you're looking for partners, you get a visit from the mafia. And today, it's not the mafia so much as the government, and you can't distinguish where the mafia begins and the government ends, because it's much the same kind of thing. So this is just terribly destructive. Instead of encouraging this kind of thing, it just you knock it right down, and you hurt it. Now, you know, Putin understands this, I think, and tries to do something about it, but so far not been very successful. The new president, Dmitry Medvedev, who comes from Gazprom, which is not a small company, I think understands this a little bit. He was trained as a lawyer. He practiced law. He believes in the rule of the law. And in fact, one of the things he said in describing what was going on with the Western oil companies and the oligarchs, he said, we had the nihilism of the law. You know, the rule of law is just gone. And so one of the things he said early on, he's only been the president for a few weeks, he said, one of the things I want to do is to set up a commission on corruption. And I'll chair it. And for me, this was a signal. This was a dig at Putin. Why is there a need for such a commission? Because things have deteriorated. Things have gotten worse. On your watch, and you, former lieutenant colonel in the KGB, should have been able to cope with this, and instead it's gotten worse. And on the list, you know, there are international groups that list corruption. Russia has fallen, so it's gotten worse. So what Medvedev is saying, I'm going to try to clean it up because you, Putin, didn't do it. That may be one way of kind of establishing his independence from Putin instead of being this protege. But in answer to your question, the rest of the economy is not in good shape. Agriculture, strangely enough, is picking up a little bit. I mean, Wayne used to sell them chickens and other things. And now what is happening, the Russians have kind of given up being self-sufficient and producing their own feedstock. So what they're doing is they're buying, you know, more meat from the West. They're just trying to not try to grow feed grains because it's too far north to do that, even when there was not the corruption, even when you didn't have the collective farm system. So they're beginning to export actually some wheat now, which they didn't do before. But small business is a problem. You know, if you have a chance to go to Russia, you'll see a lot of these street merchants in kiosks. And one of the things I always do is ask them, how much do you have to pay the police to be here? And you can get a rate, and the rate goes up each year, of course, because of inflation. But they won't tell you at first, but because they don't know what you're doing. But you can usually find out, and it is not healthy. It's just not a healthy system.
There is a growing sentiment in Russia, though, as you know, in the Senate and some of the other government agencies to prevent imports of food. It's what we have to raise it in these meetings. You raised it, Marshall, and Peter's going to die. But chicken diplomacy is really active right now, this week. There are many, many meetings going on because some parts of the Russian business community and government are trying to, once again, raise a certain kind of protective issues there, because ultimately they would like to be self-sufficient in agriculture. We have to say, historically, we know, and it's in your book, from 1895 to the beginning of the First World War. I mean, this was the grain basket, bread basket of Europe. That they had major exports, and some people say in the United Nations and other places that actually Russia could be a potential source for the world food supply situation. So,
particularly in the day when food prices are going up.
When the food prices and the oil prices are so high. Yes. We've got about a few minutes, 6 or 7 minutes or something.
Dr. Goldman, thank you for coming to Southern Center. It's a delight to have you. As in the words of our president, I look into your eyes and see your soul. I want to know when you look into the crystal ball, what do you see in 10 or 20 years in Russia? How is it playing with the United States? How is it playing with its neighbors? Has it cut off gas to Eastern Europe? What's the future hold?
Yeah. Well, I should tell you, somebody asked before about my wife, or China. And one of the things we do, we give this shoe and dance performance where we look at where do we see China 10 years from now, where do we see Russia, where do we see the United States. And I make a diagram, and if you plot, the economist coming out in me, if you plot capabilities with aspirations, the best way to say it, Japan has aspirations that are rather limited at this point, but it's a lot of capabilities. China, early on, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, had a lot of aspirations, but didn't have much in the way of capabilities. But if you project it, where it is today, where it's been, where it's going to be, you got to say, watch out, because it's going up in that direction. And Russia collapsed 10 years ago. It was at the bottom. Its abilities, it didn't have the capabilities at all. Now Putin has come back. We want to be a great superpower again. Superpower certainly in terms of energy, maybe down the road, but military as well. But sooner or later, with this wealth, unless they can not solve their population problem, they're going to address this too. But where are we in the United States? That's the thing that scares me most of all, because we've been bankrupting ourselves. If you look, one of the ways I look at this is what of our trade deficit. The Russians are having a trade surplus each year of $120 billion. I don't mean to be a mercantilist, but with a trade deficit of about $750 billion a year, oil imports about $400 billion a year, where we're dependent on other countries. Our deficit, and you look to see where the country is going. It's scary. It is scary. But maybe this is something that I should tell you about. This business, I looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. Because I mentioned before, this odd couple, the oddest couple I've ever seen in my life, the two of them. I've not seen them together physically, but I've watched them on television. Their body language is really strange. And I said that Putin, 4 times now, I've heard him bring up Bush in the most complimentary way. And so where did it come from? Well, if you go back to the year 2000, the election in the United States, Bush and Condoleezza Rice said, to discredit Gore, who headed a joint commission with Chernomyrdin, the guy here who had his own problems. They said, well, we're not going to have any more summit meetings. bilateral meetings. We gave too much away. They didn't really pressure Chernomyrdin in the way they should have. So when we take over, we won't have that. And they continued that after the election in 2001, and it continued until there was, remember, there was a crash between an American plane and a Chinese plane in April 2001, I think off Hainan Island, and then suddenly the United States was being criticized by both Russia and China, and at that point the administration changed their story and said, okay, we'll go back to this meeting. So there was a meeting in Slovenia, a summit between the two of them, and in preparation for this meeting, Condoleezza Rice gave President Bush this little book to read, which is called First Person. It's in English. It's translated from Russian, and it's a series of interviews with Putin, with his family, with his work associates, with people who knew him. Because here was Putin all of a sudden. What was he all about? And in it, Putin's mother describes how she and Putin's grandmother had Putin secretly baptized. You didn't want to do that because Putin's father and grandfather had worked for the KGB. That's not the way to win points. So he secretly baptized. In 1993, still in the Soviet era, still the Russian era, Putin is just an official. He and his wife go to Israel. And on the occasion of their going, Putin's mother gives him a cross and says, when you get to Jerusalem, have this cross blessed by the Russian Orthodox priesthood. You know, Russian Orthodox Church has a very strong presence in Jerusalem. He did. He comes back home 1996, 1997. I'm not sure of the exact year. He builds a dacha, summer home, with a sauna. The sauna is faulty. It catches fire. Putin is in it, naked. The whole thing burns down. He's lost the cross among everything else. A fireman comes by and says, Mr. Putin, I think this cross is yours. It was saved in the fire. Bush reads that. He goes to this meeting in Slovenia and he says, tell me about the cross. And for a born-again Christian, this was very important. And that was the basis where I looked into he comes out of that meeting and he says, I looked into his eyes and I got a sense of his soul. And I read that and I said, what the hell is that all about? You know, I look into his eyes. He's a KGB agent. My father was head of the CIA. Okay. Or I looked into his eyes. He's got teenage daughters. I've got teenage daughters. You know, I understand his problem. Now, I have to tell you, I told that story at a lecture I gave in Jacksonville, Florida, of all places, to a Wellesley group. And a big man comes up to me afterwards. He says, about that story you told. I said, about Bush and Putin? He says, I'm Bush's uncle. I said, oh, God, did I get it wrong? He says, well, only in part. That wasn't in the middle of the meeting. It was at the beginning of the meeting. And Bush wouldn't lay off till Putin answered him. Putin he couldn't understand what the hell has this got to do with anything. But it turns out it's a true story. And it helps to explain this bond between the two of them. And then, of course, after 9/11, you know, that Putin was the first one to get a hold of Bush to offer help, to commiserate, and that's because there's a hotline. Nobody else could get through. Line's busy except for the hotline. So this was a remnant of this, and so that also helped to do this. So.
Well, if you enjoyed that last story, you absolutely must go outside and buy this book.